Club. Please follow us on any social media to stay up to date for future events or any information. PEP is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at PEP T and Tech. The Sociology and Criminal Justice Club is on Facebook and Instagram, and their handle is CTU Soc, SOC Club. And if you're like me, you probably love the TV show Criminal Minds. We decided to put this event together because more often than not, people assume that what they see on TV mimics what happens in real life. A lot of people seem to think that sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking are handled like the show Criminal Minds shows, but this isn't always the case. This event has an expert panel so we can all gain a better understanding of how the criminal justice system actually responds to these crimes and what resources can look like for survivors of these crimes. We believe it's pretty important to know what the system actually looks like so we can all better support survivors and improve the criminal justice system overall. You can't fix a problem if you aren't really aware of what it is. We know these topics can be really hard to talk about, so if at any time you need to log off, please feel free to do so. There's a 24/7 help available from licensed counselors at the number 931-372-3331. We also want to let everybody know that tonight's event is being recorded. If you're not comfortable with your name showing up on the recording, you can change your name on Zoom by clicking the 3 dots that show up on your picture and then choosing the choice rename. If you don't want your video to show, you should turn off your camera. If you could please fill out the Google form that we just put into the chat, that would help us to keep track of attendance this evening, and I'll put that in the chat in just a second. If your professor offered extra credit, you will also put that information on that Google form, and we'll pick a few participants from the Google form to win some free swag. Tonight, our event will be moderated by Project Awaken coordinator Jack Ivasishin. We have some questions prepared ahead of time, and if you would like to ask a question this evening, you can type it into the chat. If you'd like a specific panelist to answer it, just put their name with your question. If you're uncomfortable putting your question in the chat, you can private message it to Jack on Zoom. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Jack, who will introduce our panelists. Thanks again for everybody joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction, Jamie. I am so excited to see so many pictures and names popping up, and the waiting room is still bopping. So if you ignore my eyes going to the side and clicking every now and then, I'm letting more folks join us. But like Jamie said, my name is Jack Ivasishin. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Project Awaken coordinator at Tennessee Tech. So if you haven't heard of Project Awaken, we're a grant-funded office at Tennessee Tech, and all we do is related to sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. So most of what we do is educational programs, but we also are able to provide confidential support and advocacy services at Tennessee Tech. My favorite thing probably about my job, though, is that I am very lucky to get to work really closely with the Peer Empowerment Program. And they are a great student organization at the university. So I'm really excited that they asked me to serve as moderator for tonight's event. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get the night started and meet our panelists. So panelists, I'm going to call on each of you individually. And when I do, please go ahead and introduce yourself to our attendees. Let them know who you are, your experience working with survivors, maybe how you work, if you work in the criminal justice system, if you're a medical professional, whatever that looks like for you in your world, okay? So we'll go ahead and start with Rachel Pugh. If you're willing, will you go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jack. My name is Rachel Pugh. I work as the Domestic Violence Victim Witness Coordinator for the 13th District Attorney's Office, which is here in Cookeville. So I work in Putnam County and Cumberland County in that role. And what I mainly do is work with the victims of domestic violence cases. So that can include everything from domestic assault to a little bit of stalking and some sexual assault cases. So I've been in this position for about 4 years, and before then, I worked in an advocate role at another agency here in the community, mainly doing victim services.
Okay. Wow, you have a lot of experience. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so grateful for your expertise tonight. Tara Bates, would you go ahead and go next and let everyone know who you are and why you're on our panel this evening?
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. My name is Tara Bates. I'm the Victim Services Coordinator for the Cookeville Police Department. I've been in my position for about 3 years now. I am a system-based advocate, similar to Rachel. And prior to working here at the police department, I spent 9 years working as a community-based advocate, primarily in a court setting and with hospital accompaniment, and primarily for domestic violence and sexual assault cases. But in my role here at the police department, I do a little bit of everything, though to be fair, the huge bulk of my caseload tends to be domestic violence related. So I hope I touched on everything there.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Tara. We're so glad you're here. Steve Thompson, if you'd go ahead and go next and let everyone know who you are and your experience.
Hi, Jack. Thank you. It's an honor to be involved with this panel. I'm Steve Thompson. I got involved in 1973. That was the first voice of a survivor I heard when I was at Indiana University teaching martial arts. She was sexually assaulted and she had done everything that I, as a black belt, taught her to do. And that was a very sobering experience. I hear that young woman's voice every day of my life. So when I left Indiana University and came to Central Michigan University, I needed to know why the things that I taught and why traditionally things in the martial arts are taught, why it didn't work. So I studied it, went back into IU medical school and pulled apart cadavers and did things like that because I'm kind of anal retentive compulsive obsessive. I needed to know this stuff. And I soon realized that people weren't talking to the experts, and the experts to me were the predators. So I started going into prisons in Michigan and then literally around the country because I want to know who rapists were, who they, what they look for. Do they attack from in front or behind? I mean, probably 40–50% of martial arts or self-defense classes teach how to get away from a rear approach, but sex predators don't approach from the rear almost never because they need to get what's called psychosexual gratification. You need to look in the eyes. Those are things I didn't know, who they are, who's Ted Bundy, how did he do this? So I went all over the country and did that and started teaching classes at Central Michigan University. Left Central in 1983. I was asked to work the sex crimes unit in Albuquerque, New Mexico, actually to start the sex crimes unit, and I did that. It was my opportunity to be the first one on the scene to help a survivor and to interrogate predators. It was in 1983 that I got trained by FBI profilers, sex crimes profilers on profiling. So I learned that in '83, then came back to Central Michigan and worked a little bit more here and then started the peer advocate program in '95, '96. I have been an expert witness. I've traveled all over the country. The Department of Defense asked me to revamp their peer advocate program, and so I did that, and I've taught profiling classes and been involved with courts, and this is what I do. I'll be doing this until I'm on the other side of the dirt, or until there's no more sexual aggression, whichever comes first.
Fingers crossed it's that one and that you could finally retire, right? Because you clearly
yeah,
for a lot of years.
Yeah, it's retirement, right?
Exactly. Well, Steve, thank you so much for coming. It's nice
My pleasure.
I haven't seen you in a while.
Look good, Jack.
Thank you. All right, Nicole Cook, would you go ahead and introduce yourself next to everyone?
Yes, can everybody hear me? Okay, my name is Nicole Cook. I'm an instructor in the Department of Sociology and Political Science at Tennessee Tech. And I serve the role mostly in the criminology department, criminal justice department, or that concentration rather. And I teach courses related to domestic violence as well as women in crime. My research focuses particularly on women who are serving life sentences. And what we find there with that research is that most women who are serving a life sentence are survivors. So they've experienced violence in their lifetime throughout their life course. And so that's the population that I'm most interested in researching and shedding some light on and sharing their voices. So that's my interest. Before I joined Tech, which was 3 years ago, I worked briefly as a felony probation officer. So I also worked with some survivors in my role as a probation officer. And that's kind of what gave me that push to go back to grad school and then become an instructor. So here I am, and I am so glad to see 3 full pages of faces on my end of Zoom. So thank you all for joining us.
Oh, isn't that wild? It's so wonderful to see all these little
I
tiny
love it.
images. Yes. And last but certainly not least, Tasha Cushman, would you go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody and let them know about your experience?
For having me here as well. It is also an honor to be here. I am a registered nurse. I have been a registered nurse for a long time. The majority of my career has been in emergency trauma nursing. And about 4 years ago, I got my master's degree and switched into being a nurse educator. However, about almost 13 years ago, actually, the facility that I worked at, I got into sexual assault nursing because the facility I was at did not have a SANE program, and the emergency nurses did the same exams. So it was one of those types of places. I'm in Washington, by the way. That's the state I'm in. And so I started doing that, and I developed a passion for it. Most nurses at my facility did not want to do those exams. And so I was the frequent person that would end up doing them when those patients came in. About 5 years into it, I ended up taking a second job in another county with an organization that actually had a program. And so I ended up working for a company that had a specialized SANE program and got my formalized training and became a SANE A and SANE P trained nurse. And so for the past almost 8 years now, I've done SANE A and SANE P trained work. And then in the past year in particular, and then before that, the past probably 4 years, I've also done training with actually one of our county's advocacy centers and helped training with advocates and set up training programs for other SANE nurses as well. So I've done a lot of branch out work, I guess you could say, and consulting too. So a lot of stuff surrounding SANE work.
I love it. So we don't not only have diversity in terms of what y'all do and your experience with survivors, but we even have different states represented all the way from Washington to Michigan. So thanks y'all so much for joining us. We are so grateful for your time and your expertise. So for our participants this evening, again, if you have any questions at any time, you can put them in the chat. And if you really want a particular panelist to answer it, if you write their name, I'll direct it to that panelist. If you don't care who answers it, just leave without a name and that's fine. If for whatever reason you don't want everyone else to see your question, if you go ahead and private message it to me, I will go ahead and add it to our questions list. So at any time, feel free to do that. If everyone could pause for a second though, as we start our first questions, and make sure that you go fill out that Google form so we can track attendance, and so you can put your professor's name if you're getting extra credit for attendance this evening, okay? So that link is in the chat. While you're doing that, I want to remind you that if anytime this stuff's hard to talk about, because we're talking about sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. So those are really real heavy things and they can be hard to talk about. So if at any time you need to leave, please feel free to do so. And there is 24/7 help. The number is available in the chat. That's confidential help available to anyone at any time. So even if you go to sleep tonight and you wake up, at 3 o'clock in the morning and you want to talk then, you could still call at 3 o'clock in the morning and get that same support offered to you, okay? So without further ado, we have some questions for everyone. So some of the questions I based around those episodes that PEPS encouraged people to watch. Other questions are really general. So even if you haven't watched the episodes, it'll be totally fine. But for the first question, I'm hoping that Tara and Rachel can speak to it. So Rachel, we'll have you go first and then Tara. But the question is, in the first episode that students were encouraged to watch, a celebrity was being stalked. And the Behavioral Analysis Unit, the BAU of Criminal Minds, they ask her if she's experienced any of the following. If she's experienced excessive phone calls, phone calls with hangups, gifts left anonymously, anything like that. So Rachel, I'm wondering if you first can speak to, are these common behaviors that might happen in a stalking situation? And are there any other common stalking behaviors that you might have seen in your work with survivors?
Well, probably the most common that I've seen in my work, which has solely been Putnam and Cumberland County, has been notes left on the car. It's a lot of social media now, followed up with in-person contact as well, driving by the house. But as far as like leaving gifts and that type of thing, it's mainly been notes and letters, or they go more the technology route. And because social media is very hard to prove and it's very hard to track for the prosecutors, the stalkers seem to be aware of that if they use that method, it works in their favor a lot of times. So they've definitely picked up on that the laws that we have to utilize almost hasn't caught up with technology yet. And so that's the bulk of what I have personally seen. And even the current cases that we have right now in criminal court in Putnam County, there's two ones that I'm thinking of in particular that are in criminal court, which means they've been indicted by a grand jury. Those cases involve the person physically coming onto the victim's property multiple times. And in one of the cases, they did nothing more than come onto the property, and they're literally standing there. So they don't have to say anything. They don't have to leave anything, but that's caused significant fear to the victim in that case. So those are the main ones that I've seen.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Tara, I'm wondering if you've seen anything different than what Rachel's describing, because I think a lot of times students think a stalker is like what we see on media. It's the creeper with the trench coat who hides in the bushes with binoculars. So is that your experience of what you've seen of stalking survivors, or does it look different?
What I've seen is really pretty similar to what Rachel has described. Primarily the stalking cases that I see are current or former intimate partner cases. So just by nature of that, the stalking is a lethality indicator. So I guess rather than focusing so much on the stalking, I focus more on the safety planning aspects of that stalking behavior as a manifestation of the violence that was in that relationship to begin with. So it's a little bit different in terms of dynamics from what the show illustrated there. There was one stalking case where I remember and this is a recent one, the victim described her stalker as an ex who had come onto her property and started to carve a note into her vehicle. And so that was kind of an extreme example from what I've seen. Like Rachel said, I've seen notes left and a lot of social media harassment, fake profiles, pretending to be the victim, him or herself, to try to make contact with people close to the victim, but not gifts so much. I've not seen any victims share with me having received gifts that were left for them from their stalkers. So yeah, pretty similar to what Rachel said.
We already have a great question in the chat that I think builds really well off of this. So I'm going to kick it right back to Rachel, but it's from Haley, and it says, what does prosecution for social media stalking look like? Is that something that could be useful in a criminal case, for example?
That's tough. From my experience with it, if that's all we have, then we don't have a good case. So if I am speaking to a victim and that victim has, all of the social media harassment or stalking documented, then of course I'm all ears. I want to look at it all because it gives us an idea of the context of everything, and so that way we know too the seriousness, and that'll help in talking with the victim about safety planning and that type of thing. But as far as what tools we have to utilize for social media, I can tell you we have some great investigators, and there's been a case or two where the investigator has been able to work it to get proof of the social media by actually getting confessions to it. But we relied on those confessions. We weren't able to go in and, subpoena records from Facebook or, Snapchat or any of those. So the reason why those cases turned out the way they did was the work of the detectives, not necessarily the tools that we have to work around social media, because like I said, our law just has not caught up with the technology.
Thank you so much for sharing and for that question, Lily. Along the same lines, that same episode, spoiler alert, sorry, but in that same episode, the person who the celebrity ended up being stalked by was a woman who she was friends with. And so, Steve, this question is directed for you. We want to know, are female stalkers common? And is it common that a stalker would be somebody that the survivor or victim knows?
Female stalkers on people identifying as female are rare, but they are increasing. There's four different types of stalkers. And one of the problems that I see with Criminal Minds and a lot of court cases and all that is a sexual predator is a sexual predator. There's 20 different ones. And stalkers, there's 4 different kinds of stalkers. And to say, the one that we're looking at, with a celebrity typically is what's called a delusional, where they have this idea of what it would be like when they get together. So the answer to that is it's rare to have female stalkers, but it does happen. And as I think Rachel said, most all stalking is intimate partner related, and the vast majority. And to have gifts given and all that, that's very, very, very rare. And that's a delusional. That's a person that thinks, stalkers have this expectation and they have this fantasy, and it could take a year before they act out. But my expectation might be, Jack, with you that, finally I'm going to initiate a contact with you by sending you gifts, and then I'm going to show up and you're going to just fall madly in love with me, and we're going to start picking out drapes and all that kind of stuff. And that's the delusion. That's what many of them think. And there's books on that, and it's great TV, but that's very, very unusual. Most are like what Rachel said, it's domestic related. And the reality is that those are the most dangerous. When you look at the news and see somebody identifying as a female has been killed, 99% of the time, oh, that's probably a little high, 90% of the time, it's a nearest dearest. It's somebody very close to them. And, it's somewhat predictable, but that's what most stalking is. And I think Rachel, I'm sorry, Rachel, I keep pointing at, but pointing out, stalking today is so much different than when I wrote my first book about it in the 90s. Now we've got, you can, on your smartphone, you can, if I know your phone number, I can just put in your phone number and I know where you are at any given time, and it's a free app. So stalking has become quite a major issue in college campuses and throughout the country. And it's just so much easier now with social media and what we have. We don't any longer need a GPS to attach to your car. I just know your phone number. So, we could write a book on this. There's so much to this. It's amazing.
Yeah. Steve, you've piqued their interest because we've gotten a question in the chat now from Leah asking if you can elaborate more about the 4 types of stalkers.
Well, sure. Again, I don't want to dominate this. This is it's a very complex issue. And when I first started in the 70s, I didn't know what this was about. And I've grown throughout the years, and I've had the opportunity to write some books and talk to a lot of experts, and it's very complex. People want a quick answer to something that is not a quick answer. The most common stalker is somebody like at a college or a high school where it's somebody that had a relationship and one of the 2 parties broke off the relationship. That's the most common. And the person that is, in their mind, they're the wrong party, they can't believe it's happened. So they show up at work, they show up at class, they show up, a lot of different places. And they want this person to know how much you love them. And it can be incredibly traumatic. But nonetheless, that's that's the most common. And the likelihood of them perpetrating violence against their target is very, very slim. However, the likelihood of them perpetrating violence against somebody that they might think is in between their target and them. So I'm at a bar and my ex is, I find that he or she is there because I follow him on the phone, and they're talking with somebody. That somebody they're talking with is at risk, not my ex, but that other person. Then the most violent ones are the ones that are, again, the X, and there's two kinds of those. One is called a pit bull, and this is a guy that just latches on and won't let go, and that's where most of the violence and the terminal violence, the deaths come from. Then there's another one we call the cobra that has a history of domestic violence, and when there's a split up, he'll lash out like a snake, and if he makes contact, fine in his mind. If he doesn't, he slithers away, and you'll find another one. Then we've got the delusional, which is the one that like we talked about, has been following you in newspapers, or you are a newsreader on television, and this person has this fantasy about you, and there's that delusional. And then there's another one that stalks via internet, and they're very, very good with chat rooms and with dating services and things like that. So there's four distinctly different kinds of stalker, and something that kind of bothers me is how people try to lump it all into one category, and you're looking at different investigative strategies, different things that you can do to stop this one that won't work against that one. So again, I'm sorry, I don't want to dominate. It's very complex. Good question, though. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a great summary, though, of them, because I think that's what TV and media makes it look like, is that it's just, one profile of one type of stalker that's the creeper hiding in the bushes. And that's just not.
Like there's one rapist and there's 20 different ones, and each one has different motives and different things about them.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So it looks like that answers another question we had gotten, which was, what was the characteristics of the 4 types? I think you did a great job explaining those. I noticed a couple people have joined us, so I'm going to go ahead and drop that same thing in the chat about resources if anyone needs it, and that form to fill out for everyone that you joined us, and if you're getting extra credit. As folks are doing that, Tasha, we have a question for you. So the next episode that Pep and the Sociology Club recommended people watch has one of the characters, Morgan, confronting the man who sexually abused him as a child. And so we were wondering if you could elaborate if male victims are treated the same way as female victims in the medical field. So if you had to do a forensic exam, what would the differences be between a male victim and a female victim? And what would the differences be between a child victim and an adult victim?
Well, as long as they're acting as a medical professional, they shouldn't be treating them any differently between a male and a female. Really, because then they're both humans and they're both people, and they really both should be treated with respect. And you really, anytime you're dealing with a forensic exam, you're really dealing with the process of making sure that you're treating the person as a medical patient first. So it is a forensic process, and you want to do a forensically compliant exam. So you have to go through and do all of the things you would do when you're treating a patient anyways. So regarding the male and female, there really is no difference other than anatomical differences. Of course, the genitalia are different. And if you do have to do a genitalia exam when you're getting down to the biological collection process, then of course that's clearly going to be different in that regard. But otherwise, no difference otherwise. And that's really it in that regard. So hopefully that answers that pretty straightforwardly. And then as far as adults and children, that's much more complicated. That can be quite significantly different. Of course, adults have all the opportunity to give consent, to say what they want done or not done, so long as they are lucid and able to give consent because of their state of mind, and not barring no, whether it's because of chemical influences or if they have some other impairments, for example, a medical impairment that an injury that impaired their ability to give consent, or if they had a baseline developmental delay or something that impaired their ability as well. Those things aside, adults should be able to give consent. Children, it depends on the age, of course. You have your bar set for whatever your ages are. And then below that, you have to take into consideration what's going on when the potential assault happened, if it's acute, maybe if it's chronic. Those things matter, and they dictate what that means for what you're doing in an exam. You might not do an actual exam right then. You might need to defer it. There are highly, even more than the training I've had, there's highly trained psychological forensic exams that are also done in conjunction with the medical forensic exam for children. And so you have to be very cautious of how those are completed and when they're done, so that the timing is all completed appropriately. So that, for example, if a child has been having in the home sexual violence that's been going on for, let's say, 2 years, and they've been now accused of a parent being accused of sexual violence, that you're capturing it appropriately, whether it's true or whether it's like a divorce and someone's now just saying and making it up. So you have to be careful, because you don't want to inflict undue trauma on the child either by doing multiple exams. You have to do it right so that it's just done once. So there's a lot that goes into children being done. So it's very different than an adult. Hopefully that's kind of long-winded, but hopefully that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, that totally answers the question. It makes sense that there would need to be differences, because of course you want kiddos to be able to still have consent modeled, but it's got to look a lot different, since they won't necessarily know what everything is and what's happening.
Yeah, can I jump in for just a quick second?
Please do.
When outside of incest, a lot of people don't know this. The reason I'm sorry I'm jumping in, but that cardinal that was just brought up on charges, the average pedophile, they're called preferential seductive child rapists, the average one does 200 to 300 different children in their career. And outside of incest, the preferred target, almost 70% are males. So there's a significant number of young people identifying as male that have been sexually assaulted that don't come into the system where Tasha is, because the stigma. And you know, they just keep silent. And what people recognize, you see when like this cardinal comes forward, there's going to be other young men coming forward too. And what bothers me and why I wanted to jump in was people judge, and they say, well, if you were an altar person, why didn't you come forward right then? It's very unusual when young people are assaulted, but young men, from my experience working with them especially, they don't want to talk about it. So it's not unusual for them to come forward 20, 30 years down the road after the assault. And one comes forward with this cardinal, there's going to be others. And as I said, the average is 200 to 300 different targets in their assaultive career. And of all of the predators, this is the only one that developmentally never reaches a point where they don't do it again. Once a pedophile predator, always a pedophile predator. You know, you might be able to put them through some sort of what people call rehab, but it would be like an alcoholic, where they recognize the triggers. You're not going to cure them, but you might get them so that they are recognizing, or other people around them recognize what triggers them, and you keep them from doing it. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in on this, but there's so much with those individuals that people don't know. And with this cardinal coming forward right now, or being brought up on charges right now, I thought it was kind of pertinent that I jump in. So I apologize for that, but there's a lot to pedophiles and predators.
No, I agree completely with that. And that goes hand in hand with trauma-informed care, and with even ties in with so much even beyond that, like human trafficking. And in my other job in the hospital and in education, we constantly have to work on human trafficking and working on patients who never speak out for that same exact reason and are afraid to talk forward, and working on educating staff constantly on the signs and symptoms of not only patients that are being trafficked and all of that, because it goes hand in hand, the human trafficking and the patients that are being victimized and are afraid to speak out. And so we have an entire program that's all about how do you get people to, even one glimpse, give you a bit of trust, see trust in you, so that if you can identify or see something that is suspicious to you, how do you get them to just even have that glimpse or that door of being able to know that you're a safe person, whether they will ever say something or not, but to at least know that you're a safe person, so that when they're ready, they can say something.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much silence around it. And so really a lot of the work that you all have to do, it sounds like, is educating people and starting by believing so that you can connect them to resources. So this has spurred some great questions in our chat. So our first question is, they're wondering if Morgan's situation in Criminal Minds, if it is similar to a real life case. I think, Steve, you mentioned a case with the Cardinal. I think they're wondering if you can tell them anything about that case or how they can learn more about it.
Sure. When you're looking at people that are serial and they target children, most of them are what we call preferential seductive. And it would be like in that episode, the person that ran the football program, that ran the youth area, youth ministers, people, what you find is that pedophile predators like this, it's like an addiction. And if you're a drug addict, every day you think about where's your next fix. Well, that's the same with people that go after children. They put themselves in environments where they can access children. And I'm not saying all Little League coaches, no, but I'm saying that would be where somebody would go. Where, I prefer, kids, young men, boys, say 8 to 10. Well, where would I be able to get my fix? Where would I be able to get my addiction satisfied? Little League, youth sports, things like that, playground supervisors, that's where they go. And as a culture, we have kidded ourselves in thinking that we can teach kids to protect themselves. That's a misconception. And we have done two things. One, if we thought we can teach kids to protect themselves, which research shows that doesn't happen. The second is increasing the penalty. And that's a good thing, because they're repeaters. So if they're off the street, then they can't keep getting other children. But what we as a culture need to do, and I'm so honored to be involved with this, is we've got to teach our culture what to look for. Kids can't protect themselves. So what can we do in a school system? How can we ask the right questions? Because these predators I've profiled a whole lot of them, and they're like a slug on the sidewalk. You know how those slugs, when they creep across the sidewalk, they leave this trail of slime? Well, when you know what to look for, you can look in the past of a lot of these people. I dare say that Cardinal has probably 30-year history. But people didn't ask the questions because they didn't know. And it's not stupid, it's ignorance. People just don't know. So that was, I really liked that episode, because that pointed to this person that was well respected in the community, which is very typical. You use the word TOO, they're too nice, they're too quick to volunteer, they're too everything, and almost never do they have a record. So that was a very good episode pointing out this kind of a person. So I appreciate that question.
Yeah, that was a great episode talking about grooming as well. So I think that's another question in the chat. So nicely done. Y'all are going so fast. Another question is, so what are some of the things, a lot of you are talking about, if we train people on the signs, if we train people how to support survivors. So can each of our panelists first talk about, like, if you could teach people to look out for one or two things, what would you want friends or family members or community members to know and to watch out for to keep people safe? Steve, since you're big on my screen, I'll have you go first, and then I'll go through the rest of the panel.
I'll keep it quick, because I think the thing that I would say the most is, don't discount what children say. There's 100 things we could say about profiles, but You know, I think too often these people get away with it because adults don't want to believe the child, and they deny what the child is saying frequently, and they come up with excuses. And rare is it that a child makes up these things. So first, always trust the testimony of the child. And then I always work backwards from the child, you know, and it's rare to find a child that lies about this. So listen and believe and trust.
Okay, start by listening and believing. Tara, will you go ahead and say next if there's things that folks should watch out for or things that friends or community members should be doing?
Do you mean specifically related to child sex abuse or just in general victimization?
Either way, how about general victimization?
Okay. I think the biggest one for me is respecting boundaries, even if it's the simplest boundary. If it's a boundary that's been set, teaching children that it's okay to set those boundaries, it's okay to say no over the little things, because that's where that grooming behavior begins, is with those small steps. So I think that's the biggest in my mind. If people could start there, a lot would stem from that.
Great timing right before the holidays, right? That it's okay for kids to have boundaries, and kids get to say yes to a hug too. They don't just have to hug a family member because it's a family member. We should teach them that bodily autonomy.
Exactly. And I was actually on a webinar that NCMEC was doing, and with everything being done virtually these days with COVID precautions, they were mentioning that it might be worthwhile, especially with internet victimization, to talk with kids about setting boundaries when it comes to whether or not photos of them are shared on their family members' social media. I mean, so even starting to think along those lines. And so I just thought that was a neat thing for them to present in that webinar.
Love it. Great way to model everyday consent. Nicole Cook, I'm going to tag you. Are there things, if you could have people watch out for some behaviors or red flags or warning signs, what might you say from your experience?
Yeah, sure. So I had to call back in from my iPhone. So first off, can you hear me, Jack?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. So the main thing I would say, and the main thing that I teach in my courses is that, you know, we have this idea, regardless of the course that I teach, I specifically focus on crime, so criminology, is that we often think that we're more likely to be victimized by somebody that we don't know, like a stranger, so stranger danger. And so I would encourage others to acknowledge the fact that we are actually much more likely to be victimized by somebody that we know, right? And then hand in hand with that is when we're talking about child sex abuse, maybe in particular, is that, you know, children oftentimes are afraid that they're going to get in trouble for, you know, something that's happened to them, something they have no control over. So building that trusting relationship between adult and child, whoever the adult is, be it parent, guardian, teacher, coach, anybody, to build that supportive relationship and to teach our children to communicate openly and not be afraid of repercussions or not be afraid of getting in trouble. But the main thing that I do teach throughout my courses is this idea of stranger danger and how that is, by and large, a myth. You know, sure, there are these random incidents of stranger attacks, but we are much more likely to be victimized by somebody that we know. And we saw in the episode, I had to write down these names, with Morgan, we saw in this episode, you know, where he knew the person who victimized him, and as well as James, the younger boy, who knew the person who victimized them and who were in positions of power and positions of authority in their lives. So I think that's something that we need to maintain a focus on.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that too, because we got a question about stranger danger in the chat. So it sounds like.
Oh, awesome. I didn't even see it. Okay.
Nice. Tasha, I'm going to tag you. If you could teach, you know, community members or loved ones to watch out for something, a warning sign, what would that be?
I definitely would tag on a little bit to something that Nicole even mentioned as well, but the openness and the communication, both with whether you're little, whether you're a teenager, whether you're even growing up, especially, and even as Steve had even mentioned, it's so common. And in my work, I see so many of the patients I see, it's the majority by far have been victimized by people they know. And it all seems to come from and originate from Even going back to, and it's not, if you just take away stalkers and if you just look at where this originally came from, it's if you could just go into keeping communication open, not having secrets. So little kids not having secrets, teenagers not being isolated, adults, listening to your family, your friends outside of this one person. So from all of those ages, not having secrets, not, keeping others around you, being open to them, and just not having that bubble of that one person and leaving the door open for others to hear you and you to hear them. Somehow that piece and having that be open and not shut off is a real key in not letting that incident then occur somehow in there. So that open door of communication is big for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of counteracts maybe some of that grooming behavior. Maybe you see, concerning things more quickly than if there's an open communication line.
Yeah. I think it lets others see or hear or help you at any age.
Absolutely. And Rachel, last but certainly not least, can you add anything to this conversation of things community or family or friends could be watching out for or doing?
Sure. I will try. They included some good examples. But there was one person that put in the chat, they were talking about domestic abuse and some signs of, that someone might be abused, but they're hiding it. With a lot of the victims that I work with now, where they come into court and it might be 2 or 3 months after the assault that we have documented. It's not uncommon for numerous reasons for that victim not wanting to no longer want the charges to be pursued by our office. And so I may very well have that conversation with the victim where they're saying, oh no, I know it says on that paper that this happened, but it really didn't. And so-and-so is not abusive. I'm really not an abusive relationship. It just looks bad. And so I guess what are some signs, that I look for? I think a big part of it is getting that rapport with the victim. If they can't trust me or if they're concerned that my reaction is going to be negative, and I'm not always the right one in that position because they know I'm with the district attorney's office, and so there's a lot at stake. But I think in general, if you ask questions, keep that communication line open, watch what your reaction is, so that way they can trust that whatever they're going to say to you, your reaction is not going to be bad. It's not going to be judgmental. It's not going to be, well, oh my gosh, why did you not do something sooner? That type of thing. If you can keep it at that level and not try to maintain your level of being in shock by what they tell you, I think you're more likely to get them to keep talking about what happened to them. Because I've noticed that a lot of times people will throw out just a little bit of information and they're testing you to see, okay, what is your reaction? And if you didn't pass that test, you're not going to get any more. But if they gave you just that little bit, then they want to talk. They just don't know if you're the right person yet. So I think it's making sure you're at the point to where you can receive that information if someone does in fact choose you to share that with, because this is their story, this is their information. So it's an honor to be the one that's chosen to talk about it with them. If you keep it like that instead of immediately rushing to judge, you'll get a lot further. And as far as recognizing abusers, the main signs are someone that's overly controlling. Watch for those controlling behaviors and trust your gut with that. If I think it's really easy to, after it happens, to kind of question it and not want to think badly of somebody. But if they show that sign of them, trust it and watch it a little closer and just see how things progress. Or depending on what happened, go ahead and talk to an advocate. That way you have your plan B, that if you need to get out of the relationship.
Love it, starting to safety plan already. Rachel, I have another question that we've come up with when watching, and that's that when we're watching Criminal Minds and stuff, a lot of times the misconceptions all students have is that the criminal justice system looks just like Criminal Minds, where someone reports something to the police, that person is immediately arrested and they're in jail the next day for forever. So I was wondering if you can talk about what that actually looks like from the time that maybe a report is made to when a final arrest or conviction might happen.
Yeah. It depends on the type of charge, but most of the charges that probably Tara and I both see are domestic assault charges, to where if that person is still on the scene, if the offender is still on scene when the officer arrives and they're able to find probable cause to make the arrest, then they would be normally immediately booked in and on a 12-hour hold. We've seen that change a little bit in the past several months with COVID, where we haven't always been able to count on that, which is huge. And I know Tara and I have both advocated for the fact that we need to be able to depend on that. That's really important. But normally after the 12 hours, every offender is given a bond amount and the majority make it, which means they get out and they don't usually come back to court for a month or so. And so it means the victim normally won't be back in court for 2 to 3 months at the earliest. And for a domestic assault here in Tennessee, it's an A misdemeanor, meaning that unless they're already on probation for something else or they picked up some heavy drug charges along with that domestic assault, they're probably never going to see any more jail time. Worst case, they're looking at probation. That's so that 12 hours may be all they get.
I think that that can often be shocking to a lot of people because that's definitely not what you see in TV, right?
Yes.
As an advocate, I'm going to tag to Tara for this one. Tara, I know you often are connecting with victim or survivor right after, I think the day after that person is usually arrested. Can you speak to like what is the typical state of a survivor at that time? Like what could a friend do to support someone who you might be talking to on the phone, whose perpetrator maybe just went to jail for 12 hours, but that's probably the only jail they'll see?
It varies. Victim reactions vary. Domestic violence is complicated. The history of that relationship is something that I kind of have to feel my way through in reading the report and in looking to see if there were past calls for service involving those two parties. Mm-hmm. So with some victims that I talk to, it's an immediate, this was blown out of proportion. It was a misunderstanding. This he shouldn't have been arrested. I didn't call the police. I don't know why he's in jail. I need this dismissed right now. So sometimes that's the reaction that I get. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's well, why is he getting out? Why is he getting a bond? And of course, I use he and she just because of the statistics that we see. So please, no one jump my case about my choice of pronouns to apply to victims and defendants here. But sometimes it is a victim who definitely needs to have some very specific safety planning around criminal justice system response. So on my end, that involves reminding them that there are no contact orders in place and how they can make those no contact orders work for them. Sometimes their response to that is, well, that's just a piece of paper. That will do me no good, which is a very real concern. But a no contact order is just another tool in the toolbox for a victim to use to try to protect themselves. And there's far more to it than just a protective order. So sometimes it's, well, who are some safe people that can help watch your back? How are, in what circumstances do you feel most vulnerable in your day-to-day routine? When do you think you might be most likely to encounter the defendant? Just trying to get victims to think through these contingencies so that they can be a collaborative partner in that safety planning. Because really, they know their situation better than any of us ever could. So we need to help them to access the information that they already have. They already know a lot of what are protective strategies that have worked for them in the past. So I'm afraid at this point I've lost track of the question, and I hope that I've answered it. Feel free to let me know if not.
No, you totally have. That was perfect. Totally perfect answer. And it brought about another one in our chat. So that's how you know we're doing well, right? When it's spurring questions for our audience. But this next question that has been brought up is for Nicole. And Nicole, that question is, what can probation look like for domestic abuse? If someone, for example, doesn't get jail time, but perhaps gets probation instead, what might that look like?
Okay, that's an awesome question to whoever posed that question. As a probation officer, I didn't have a whole lot of contact with people who had been charged with domestic abuse and sentenced and under probation for that sole charge. But from a probation officer standpoint, I will say that, and from a sociological standpoint as well, we do see that there are some larger root causes that are causing domestic violence, that are causing all classes of crime. And so from one of the things I told you all that when I was a probation officer, one of the catalysts for me to return to grad school was looking at these larger issues and seeing how there were some underserved populations, specifically those who are on probation, and not being able to plug those people into resources. So for me, as both a former probation officer and as a sociologist who is in education, I would say it's very important to plug both survivors as well as offenders into resources. So it's important that we have that support system available to both parties in this situation. There's never an excuse, there's never a justification for violence, but if we can try to understand some of those root causes, so maybe we have alcohol or drug abuse or substance misuse, maybe we have people who are living in poverty, people who are experiencing unemployment or other stressors, just larger scale stressors. From a sociological standpoint, if we can look at those broad issues and attempt to address those, I think we might start to see some difference. And then another thing here is not to focus solely on the survivors to provide the solutions here, right? So we need to kind of place the onus on the offenders as well. What is it that's causing these behaviors? What can we do to support you to prevent further instances of this behavior? Because again, there's no excuse, there's no justification, there's no reason, but we have to look at, from a societal standpoint, how do we maybe, in some ways, I don't want to say promote violence, but if we look at the media, perhaps we do. And what can we do to solve that, and whose responsibility is it? And I think that oftentimes as a society, we place a lot of that burden on survivors. So to shift that focus, right, to the people who actually engage in this type of violence, but to also support them, right? So not to solely place the focus on them and punish them. So somebody who studied people who are serving extended sentences or life sentences, we know that these very harsh punitive sentences oftentimes do not work. So what can we do to plug somebody into resources within the community while at the same time keeping survivors safe? So I hope that answers.
Yeah, I think it answered it really well. I think what you lead well into as well is another concern, and that's, I think overwhelmingly, it sounds like general public and society as a whole doesn't really know these issues, doesn't know how to respond or how to address these systemic problems. And so I'm going to go one-on-one to each of you panelists, and I'm wondering if you can tell us what sort of training did you receive in your role? And do you think that people in your role or who you interact with are properly trained? If not, what sort of training differences need to be made in our society so that we're better supporting survivors? So Nicole, since you just talked, I'll just pass it right back to you. Can you tell us about your training, where we might need more training?
Sure. So I will say, as a probation officer, I did not receive a whole lot of training when it came to dealing with either survivors or offenders related to the topics that are under discussion tonight. So a lot of this came from my own examination of these issues. But then when I went to grad school as well, working with women who are serving life sentences and discovering, for my population, it was about, or my sample rather, it was about 70 to 85% of those women had experienced abuse at some point in their lives. And about 60% of those women attributed their abuse or their life histories as relating in some way to their life sentence. And so it was when I started to do that research that I really realized that violence plays a large role in these women's pathways to prison. Through no fault of their own. This is life experience. These are things that they had survived and things that they had experienced throughout their lifetime. And so I really have to place my focus on those women. Those are the women who taught me or who showed me a lot of these root causes and kind of opened my eyes to the prevalence. Because to be completely honest, when I was working in probation, like I said, there was a lack of training there. and a lot of misconception, a lot of misunderstanding. And so I wasn't as well informed as I should have been to be able to do my job adequately. But it was when I started talking one-on-one with the women who are serving life sentences that I began to realize the extent of the problem, and also how it's very misunderstood, right? So when we look at people who are serving life, male, female, either way, we often look at their crimes. We focus on their crime, but we don't focus on their history. So what happened throughout their lifetime that might attribute or might have played a role in where they are now. So I really kind of credit those women for teaching me more so than any class that I ever could have taken throughout grad school, throughout undergrad, or anything that I could sign up for today. I think it's hearing from those women who had those experiences themselves that have really taught me and really kind of gave me that push to share what I know with others as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely, that lived experience. Tara, I'm going to tag you. What about what training have you had for your role, and do you think that there is adequate training for folks in your role or for the law enforcement who you work with?
Well, my training, of course, I have my undergrad degree, and I'm in grad school currently, and then I'm a credentialed advocate as well. So I guess I'm constantly looking for opportunities for training, even now, all these years into the field. But like Nicole said, I think that the best training that anyone can get is in listening to the survivors who have encountered these systems and who have lived these experiences, because they're the ones who know what does and doesn't work. They're really where you learn the most. And that's not to say that we ought to burden survivors with teaching the rest of us how to be compassionate, but the advocacy field really is a survivor-driven field. So you'll find a lot of advocates who have their own experiences surviving victimization. So I think I just want to reiterate Nicole's point there that talking with the people impacted by these crimes is the best learning experience. Now, as far as officers are concerned, their role in the process is different than our role in the process as advocates. So their focus is slightly different. And that's not to say that they can't, in some areas, improve their response in order to encourage a victim to engage in the subsequent process a little bit better. And I think that just comes with, again, just experience. The more that they encounter victims, the more that they see those viewpoints and listen to maybe the impacts that they hadn't anticipated, the more that they can learn from that and shift their response accordingly. So I hope that answers that.
Yeah, absolutely. Tasha, I'm going to tag you next. And so you're talking about what training you've received and if you think, medical professionals in general have gotten enough training about how to deal with survivors. There's also a particular question for you, if you can talk just briefly about the difference between SANE training, sexual assault nurse examiner training for adults versus peds. Is it a separate training, the person wants to know?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, you have to have your nursing license to be a SANE nurse. And so I had to go to, well, there's different tracks for your nursing license. And I first got my associate's degree, which was a 2-year prerequisites. And then I got my 2-year nursing degree, bachelor or associates of science in nursing. And then I went and got my bachelor's in science of nursing and then eventually my master's. But to practice with to take my state boards, I had first gotten my associates. You can go get a bachelor's first. So I had that. And then to become a sexual assault nurse examiner, in most states, you have to go get an additional set of training, which usually is a 40-hour course that you can take that gives you specialized, it's a very specific course on sexual assault nurse examiner training. And actually, when you take that, then in addition, with a certain amount of hours practicing as a sexual assault nurse examiner, you can also then register and take the sexual assault nurse exam for adults and then get a certification in SANE training. Most people don't do that because of the cost of it. You don't really get more other than the recognition for it, and the cost associated with it and the upkeep of it is kind of a lot. So like for me, I've never done that for just that reason. And then the pediatric portion of it is very similar. It's a whole separate course focused solely on peds. I would say variances, and what if there's a lack of something, yes, there's more to it that I wish that it were included, such as something we talked about a little bit earlier, like trauma-informed care. There's a little tiny bit in it, but when it comes to what we're dealing with and such the degree, if there's anything in all of nursing that does require such a high elevation of sensitivity, delicacy, you're talking about people not only in their most vulnerable state, but you have people in shock. You have people sometimes that are on drugs or intoxicated. You are having people in all array of emotional states, and you need to be able to pivot and adjust at every moment when you're dealing with them. And so the trauma-informed care aspect is so huge, and I really think that they need to amp that up a lot more in the training aspect. Additionally, and this is where it really gets sticky, is that across the country, it's so different because as I mentioned, my initial experience was as I had to do exams in an emergency room with no formal training. I didn't get that until I went to another job where I was employed by a company that was able to provide me that training, and their sole focus was making sure that that we had what you call forensic compliance in your medical exams, your forensic medical exams you're doing. And I know across the country, it's still not, that's not consistent. It's so different wherever you go. And there are many places that still have their emergency rooms doing that. And part of the problem with that is your emergency physicians are who are determining what STI medications are being prescribed. And emergency physicians aren't getting this training in their medical programs. They're learning on the jobs as well. And some people take the time to learn what to do appropriately. And some people just, fly by the seat of their pants and say to their neighbor, what are we supposed to do? And if you think about what sensitivity and what how badly these patients need our every last bit of good care given to them, flying by the seat of our pants isn't the way to go. So we need a lot more, and we need to do better.
Yeah, sounds like there's a big area that, isn't really addressed. People kind of think, oh, as long as we have SANEs, we don't need to train the rest of the medical community. But survivors someday are going to go to a primary care physician, and maybe someday we'll have family or we'll need some care. And it's an important piece of their medical history that all medical professionals need to be ready to respond to appropriately. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Steve, I'm going to tag you next. Will you tell us about your training and areas where you think that training needs to be improved for other folks who interact with survivors?
Well, I'm the old guy here. I got involved, as I said, in 1973. That was the first voice of a survivor. And I was responsible for her being sexually assaulted because I was at Indiana University and there was a serial signature rapist that assaulted a lot of young women. And being one of the resident black belts, I was asked to teach self-defense. And I did. And I didn't know anything about sexual aggression, but I was this black belt. Long story short, this young woman did everything that I taught her to do. That's still being taught today, and it has less than a 50% chance of success. And she was sexually assaulted. And when I spoke with her at the hospital, the first thing she said was, I did everything you told me to do. Why didn't it work? And I hear her voice every day. And so from 73 until today, I'm a street person. I read everything I could read. If you look back in the 70s, 80s, there was not a lot known. And I read everything I could read, and I soon learned that nobody was talking to the experts, which were the predators. So that's why I already said, I started going into prisons, talking. I wanted to find out from Bundy, why did you target this person and not that person? And who are these people? What do they do? And so I taught basically did that. And then in '83 with the Albuquerque thing, there's some things there that I recognized. Like I was talking with literally at the time there hundreds of survivors, and something that really bothered me is why in law enforcement do we have to talk with the survivor immediately post-assault? I recognized within a few weeks being there that there was this, they didn't recognize what was going on a lot of times. They didn't remember. And so I talked to the chief there and said, hey, chief, can't we wait a couple days? Can't we talk to a survivor on their turf, not on our turf? And that was revolutionary. This is 1983. That was revolutionary back then. And now it's common practice. But there's things that just make sense that for some reason we still do things kind of, some places, things kind of half-assed, and people don't know exactly what this issue is all about. And as I said, I'm old, and I'm not as tolerant as I once was. I don't have a lot of room in my life for assholes anymore, pardon me. But there's a lot of ignorance out there, and it's hurting survivors, and that personally offends me. Now, you asked what I think could be done. I think one of the weakest links, I mean, we know that the reporting rate is so incredibly low because, and I think, I don't remember who it was that taught, I think it was Nicole, we still blame survivors. We still look at the survivor. What were you worried about? And that has nothing to do with it. I did the study in Albuquerque. What a person, how they dress has zero to do with target selection, but yet the narrative is still, what did you do? What did you say? And when a narrative is that survivors bring it on themselves, whether it's a male, female, adult, or a child, then we make assumptions and draw conclusions based on that false narrative. And we've got to change the narrative. Behavior is a function of choice. And we've got to look at I'm going to be very gender specific. Why do generally men rape? Why do we stalk? Why do we beat our partners? Why do we harass? Let's get at that. And I'm telling you, it's almost impossible to get in the public schools or to convince the media to look at these issues and be responsible with it. And last thing, and then I'll shut up, is I think in the legal system, one of the weakest links are the prosecuting attorneys. My experience, and I do trainings all over the country, profiling and working with law enforcement, and if they don't take a case forward, then it's done. And my experience is most prosecutors don't have a clue about the behavior patterns of predators, the target selection, about all of these things. And if we could just get them so that they can understand a little bit more, the clearance rate would go higher, believing survivors instead of going into these false narratives, believing survivors, because 86% of survivors come out of the system quickly. What's the report rate? 5%. So you get 5 out of 100 coming into the system. 86 of those people, 86% come out. Why? Because the first thing they'll say is they don't believe me. And they don't believe them because they've got this narrative of what real rape's all about, and they don't have a doggone clue what it really is about. So we've got to do more education with our legal system, with the media, how they present sexual aggression. When there's just so much that we need to do. That I don't know that we're going to get there, but I agree with Nicole. We're too survivor-centered as far as looking at responsibility. Behavior is a function of choice. There's a lot of things that go into why somebody might assault, but the bottom line is I've dealt with thousands of predators and multiple thousands of survivors. I've never dealt with a predator yet that did not know what they were doing. Behavior is a function of choice. And I'm sick and tired of generally people in my gender being given this get out of jail free card because, oh, he was this, or it was too drunk, or I've not found that to be the case. So I'm going to shut up, but it still offends me.
I think I could speak for everyone with never shut up. Yes, absolutely. I think it's really encouraging that we're having this conversation because our primary audience is students who are in a sociology or criminal justice major. So students, you take this with you and you train the folks who you work with to do better. And yeah, change isn't going to happen overnight, but if we each are influencing our own spheres, we can be making those changes over time. And so as I'm passing to Rachel, I want to let folks know last chance for questions you might have because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So as you're thinking of if you have any last thank yous or questions, Rachel, I'm wondering if you can tell us about your training, and again, then if you see any training gaps from where you're situated in the system.
Yeah, sure. Well, I can tell you that the position that I'm in now, they relied heavily on my prior training and the position that I had before that as being a community-based advocate. But oddly enough, that training started out with me being an intern and having no training, and the phone's ringing, they're short-staffed, and someone has to pick up the phone. And so it's a little scary looking back on it, honestly, because I was very young at the time, no experience with it, but I was really interested in it. So I survived that part, and hopefully I didn't do too much damage to the people that I worked with. Because looking back, that's a huge fear that I have in mine, right? And so similar to Tara, her and I have worked quite a bit over the years together. A lot of it is finding your own training, reading a ton. And so the interest has to be there, or else you're never going to get to a point where you can do well at the job. And so that my current position depended heavily on my prior experience. Once I got to the position here, there's a lot of just on the job training. You have to get out there and do it. And so that means you're going to do it wrong a lot of times. And then those times that you do it right, you better take notes so you can do right the next time. So looking back, I wish there was more training. I wish someone had sat down with me and said, oh, hey, this is how you talk to a victim. Because a lot of that I just learned by being in that position before. And now I'm in grad school, and I think part of the constantly searching, looking for that additional training has led me to grad school so I can do better and learn more about trauma, and how to interact the best way with these victims that I encounter every day to not do more damage or not do more harm than good, rather. But right now too, I work primarily with attorneys, and they're just a whole different animal than the majority of you all are. And I have, people in the community like Tara and at other organizations, that I bounce ideas off of, because the attorneys are so different than the work that we do. And so I do wish there was more training with them for them to learn how to speak with victims, because they're not trained that in law school. They're not at all. And so luckily, with a lot of the cases that I'm on, I'm right there beside the district attorney as we're talking to victims, so I can be the softer one out of the two. They can ask a question and you're like, oh no, that's not how you need to phrase it, that type of thing, and then you re-ask it, but in a much more gentler approach. That's usually what that dynamic looks like. And then afterwards, I like the positive reinforcement of, oh, you did this really well, hoping that they do that again with the next victim. But there just doesn't seem to be a whole lot of time or energy spent with training prosecutors on how to interact with victims. There's just not. And but at the same time, even the victim witness coordinators like myself, they're great. There's a lot of really, smart, hardworking victim witness coordinators that I've met across the state. But with each district, it really varies. And I know the training is not what I would like to see it be.
Yeah. Sounds like that's something that's just true across the board, right? That a lot of people just don't know. And some roles, it's that stupidity of you should know and you're not. You should know better and you're not. And so I don't have much tolerance for that either. But I think a lot of it does go back to that ignorance, and where that education piece is so important, and that we all need to be educating ourselves and those around us. Because, your friend might make up the next jury, or your friend might become a prosecutor who could really make a world of difference if they learn this stuff. So I want to give a last opportunity if any of our participants have any last questions for our wonderful panelists. I'm getting so many private messages of, these panelists are incredible. So you are so loved. I hope you can feel that, how appreciated and loved you are, because I'm hearing it in my private Zoom chats. We're so grateful that folks attended to come and learn, because I think a common theme of tonight is we can't fix a problem we can't see, right? And so it's really important that we're all here learning about this. And to our panelists, thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here and sharing your expertise with us. Looks like we have one final question, and then I'll pass it back to the Peer Empowerment Program to end the evening. But the final question, and I will leave it open to whatever panelist feels equipped and wants to answer it. But the question is, about how accurate would you think that the show You on Netflix is when it comes to stalking and the use of social media? So to our panelists, have any of you seen that show, and would any of you feel comfortable to address that question? Nicole nodding. Nicole, are you comfortable talking about it?
I have seen the show. I actually just finished it like less than a month ago. I had to stop because it's pretty heavy content and it's very scary. And I think the point, I haven't seen the question, I'm on my iPhone, I don't know how to work Zoom on the iPhone, but I heard the word social media pop up there. And I think that that's something that's very important, is to acknowledge the power of social media and how technology, social media, all of these things have impacted the way that we communicate with one another. But it's also broadened the scope of victimization, right? So we're much more able, I guess, to track people, to keep tabs on people. And we're also much more able to be anonymous online or through social media networks, which is kind of terrifying. So like I said, the show You was hard for me to get through, but I think it did draw light to some of the extremities that we can see these stalking cases go to. I don't have a whole lot of experience with stalking, so I feel like somebody else might be better equipped to answer this question than I am. But even if we are seeing an extreme here with this television show, because again, it's marketed, right? It's a television show, multiple seasons. And so perhaps we are seeing extreme cases here, but it's also important to acknowledge that all of these things that we saw throughout the show You have some tints of reality to them as well. And so much more often than not, a lot of these cases, when it comes to stalking, are much more extreme than what we might realize, right? 'Cause again, multiple panelists touched on the fact that cases are underreported, and that includes stalking as well. So there are so many cases we don't know about. So yeah, I'm gonna pass it off to somebody else because I don't feel that I'm super well equipped, but I have seen the show and it's very terrifying.
And Steve, you would probably be the best person, and since you haven't seen the show, it's hard, but it totally merges everything you talked about. So it's probably like a bunch of, other than the delusional, well, maybe some of that too. It's like all the stalking stuff merged into a bunch of it combined. So in regards to the question of how accurate it is probably not as accurate because of just purely that. Maybe that might answer the question a little bit, because it is pretty extreme, like you said, Nicole, and it's pretty out there as far as how far he takes it. But it does go back to the point of it's an intimate partner, and he goes totally off the rails. So I guess in that regard, not letting it get that far, in what can you do to prevent that?
Wonderful. To be cognizant of folks' time, I think it's fair to say we all could talk about these things all night because it's so important and there is so much work to be done. And so thank you to TTU Sociology Club and Criminal Justice Club and the Peer Empowerment Program for organizing this. Maggie from the Peer Empowerment Program, would you go ahead and close out the evening for us?
Oh, she's muted.
Maggie, you're muted. Start again.
Sorry. So we just wanted to say thanks again to the Sociology and Criminal Justice Club for helping us put this on. And can we get like a clapping reaction for all of our awesome panelists? I've never used Zoom. I think this is how I clap. Yeah. All right. And like Jack said, I'm with PEP and we're a student organization. And if anybody is interested in joining us after this, we have an application you can fill out on our website, which is just tntech.edu/awaken/PEP. And as Jack shared on the screen, we've got our starfish story, which is really important for PEP. So I'll just tell it in case anyone's never heard it. One day, a man was walking along the beach when he noticed a boy picking something up and gently throwing it into the ocean. Approaching the boy, he asked, "What are you doing?" The boy replied, "Throwing the starfish back into the ocean. The surf and the tide are going out, and if I don't throw them back, they'll die." "Son," the man said, "don't you realize there are miles and miles of beach and thousands of starfish? You can't make a difference." After listening politely, the boy bent down, picked up another starfish, and threw it into the surf. Then, smiling at the man, he said, "It made a difference to just that one." So that's kind of like our mission with PEP. This is super important because, you know, not everyone can do everything for a survivor, but you can be that difference to that one person. And I feel like that's where it really starts. And just again, I know Jack and Jamie both mentioned this, there is 24-hour help available. We've got the number in the chat just in case anyone needs it. And please don't be afraid to reach out because there's nothing wrong with needing help. And again, thanks for coming out, guys.
Thank you.
Having me and us.
Yes, thank you all so much. I'm very proud to see so many familiar faces. So you all are really the change. You're where the change starts. So thank you all to my students for joining us tonight. And thank you, Jack and PEPS, as well as the Sociology and Criminal Justice Club for helping us put this on.
Wonderful. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.